30 pieces of silver. The price of a slave. That was the price Judas accepted to betray Jesus, and with it, he opened the door to the trial. The mockery, the scourging, the nails, and the cross.
Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.
After 3 years beside him, Judas sold the man he called Teacher to enemies who were waiting for a way to destroy him. But Judas was only the beginning of what that night would reveal. Before sunrise, the men closest to Jesus would discover how quickly fear can break loyalty. One would sell him, another would deny him. The rest would run. And hidden beneath that collapse was a lesson Jesus had already spoken. A lesson that would only make sense after everything fell apart. Stay with me until the end, because this is not just the story of Judas. It is the story of failure, regret, and the question every broken soul eventually asks, is there still a way back? The cross stood outside the city where criminals were sent to disappear in public. Jerusalem moved beneath him, restless with Passover crowds and Roman soldiers watching from below. The same city that had welcomed him with branches now watched him bleed. Above his head, a sign named him King of the Jews. Below his feet, soldiers divided his clothes as if he were already forgotten. 2 thieves suffered beside him, each breath dragging pain through their broken bodies. Priests passed by with satisfaction hidden beneath holy robes and careful words. Some mocked him because they thought the nails had finally proved them right. Others watched from a distance, too afraid to come closer, too broken to leave.
Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.
Then Jesus prayed. Luke 23:34. Even at the cross, forgiveness was not only something Jesus taught, it was something he bled. But the most painful silence came from the men who should have been there. The 12 had walked with him through villages, storms, hunger, danger, and miracles. Now their places around him were empty. Jesus hung between heaven and earth, abandoned by the ones he loved. The hands that touched lepers were stretched open against Roman wood. The feet he had washed the night before were now pierced. The mouth that spoke forgiveness now tasted blood, thirst, and dust. From the outside, it looked like betrayal had won. It looked like fear had swallowed loyalty, and darkness had buried every promise. This was not only the death of a teacher, it was the collapse of everything his disciples thought they were. Their courage had failed, their promises had broken, and their love had not been enough. Yet the cross was not where the story truly began. To understand how Jesus ended up here, abandoned by his own disciples, we have to go back before the nails, before the garden, before the fire. Back to the years when these men walked beside mercy and still misunderstood it. The story began years earlier, with ordinary men living ordinary lives. Some were fishermen, pulling wet nets from Galilee with tired hands. Most mornings looked the same, and most nights ended with aching backs. Then Jesus stepped into that familiar world and said,
"Come, follow me."
Matthew 4:19. 2 words were enough to pull men away from nets, tax tables, and everything familiar. Peter was among them, quick to speak and quicker to act. Andrew followed too, along with James and John from their father's boat. Matthew left a tax booth, walking away from money that had made him hated. Others followed with questions they could not name. Judas followed too. At first, nothing about him seemed different from the rest. He walked the same roads, ate the same bread, and heard the same voice. When Jesus healed the sick, Judas stood close enough to see their faces change. When storms rose on the lake, he watched waves fall quiet beneath one command. When thousands grew hungry, he saw a small meal become enough for everyone. For 3 years, Judas stayed close enough for everyone to call him a disciple. Peter was different from Judas, but not because his heart was unbreakable. He loved Jesus openly, fiercely, and often before he understood himself. When Jesus walked on water, Peter stepped out of the boat. For one impossible moment, his feet held because his eyes stayed fixed. Then the wind frightened him, and the water swallowed his courage. Jesus caught him before the lake could close over his head. That moment showed Peter clearly. Faith was real in him, but fear was real too. He could step toward Jesus with courage and still sink seconds later. Yet Jesus pulled him up, corrected him, and kept him close. The disciples saw things no generation before them had ever seen. Blind men opened their eyes to daylight for the first time. Lepers looked at clean skin they had not touched without shame for years. Outside one tomb, Jesus wept before calling Lazarus back to life. Still, the disciples did not understand everything they witnessed. They argued about greatness while Jesus spoke about serving. They imagined thrones while he kept speaking about a cross. They wanted victory they could recognize, but Jesus kept describing surrender. More than once, he told them he would be handed over and killed. He also told them he would rise again on the third day. But how could the one who raised the dead be taken by death? How could the one who commanded storms be arrested by men with torches? They heard him, but kept walking as if the warning belonged to some distant future. The closer Jesus came to Jerusalem, the heavier the air became. Crowds still followed him, but the leaders watched with colder eyes. Jerusalem waited with pilgrims, priests, soldiers, worship, fear, and hidden plots. Peter still believed loyalty would be simple when danger finally came. Judas still sat close enough to pass for faithful. The others still imagined they would stand when the night tested them. For 3 years, they walked beside the one who knew them completely. Still, he taught them, fed them, corrected them, and called them friends. Then Peter asked a question about forgiveness, not knowing the answer would one day become his only way back.
Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him?
He asked Jesus. Then Peter offered the number that probably sounded generous in his own ears.
Up to 7 times?
Matthew 18:21. 7 times meant patience beyond what most people would offer. It meant the wound had happened again, and mercy still had not closed its hand. But Jesus did not let Peter turn forgiveness into something he could count and control. He answered,
I do not say to you, up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7.
Some translations render the phrase as 77 times, but the point remains the same. Jesus was not giving Peter a larger number to calculate. He was taking the calculator out of Peter's hand because forgiveness was not meant to be measured. Then Jesus told him a story about a servant who owed an impossible debt. The man stood before a king with nothing but fear and empty hands. No bargain could save him, and no promise could make the balance smaller. His home, his family, his future, and his freedom could all be taken. But instead of crushing him, the king released him from the debt entirely. The servant walked out free, carrying a mercy he had not deserved. Then he found another servant who owed him a small amount by comparison. The debt was real, but it was nothing beside what he had just been forgiven. Still, he grabbed the man and demanded payment with unforgiving hands. He had been forgiven an ocean, but refused to release a cup. When the king heard what happened, his question exposed the servant's heart.
Shouldn't you also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you?
Matthew 18:33. Peter heard that story with the rest of the disciples nearby. Judas heard it too. Neither of them understood yet how close this lesson would come. Peter probably thought Jesus was teaching him how to respond to someone else's failure. He did not know the answer was waiting for his own. One day, forgiveness would stop being an idea and become his only hope. Judas heard about debts canceled, mercy received, and compassion refused. Yet hearing mercy is not the same as trusting it when guilt arrives. A man can know the words and still run from the one who spoke them. Jesus was teaching it to men who would soon break his heart. Forgiveness was not a number to reach and then abandon. It was the way God treats people who owe more than they can repay. The road to Jerusalem grew shorter, and the air around Jesus grew heavier. The lesson had been spoken, but it had not yet become a wound. That would happen later, in a room prepared for Passover. There, Jesus would not merely teach mercy with a story. He would kneel before the men who were about to break his heart. The room had already been prepared by the time evening settled over Jerusalem. Outside, the city was crowded with families gathering for Passover. Inside, Jesus sat with the 12 men who had followed him for 3 years. The table was familiar, but something in the room felt heavier than celebration. This meal remembered the night God delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt. It was supposed to taste like rescue, covenant, freedom, and remembered mercy. Then Jesus rose from the table. He took off his outer garment and wrapped a towel around his waist. The room must have gone quiet as he poured water into a basin. Foot washing was slave's work, the lowest task given to the lowest servant. Yet Jesus knelt before the men who still did not understand him. One by one, he took their dusty feet into his hands. Among those feet were the feet of Judas. Jesus knew where those feet would walk after the meal. Still, he washed them. Then he came to Peter, and Peter could not bear the sight. He said,
You shall never wash my feet.
John 13:8. Peter could accept Jesus as Lord, but not as a servant kneeling low. Jesus answered,
Unless I wash you, you have no part with me.
John 13:8. The words reached Peter quickly, and his resistance turned into panic.
Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head.
John 13:9. When the washing was finished, Jesus returned to the table.
I have given you an example, that you should do as I have done to you.
John 13:15. Then the mood in the room changed. Jesus looked at the men around him and said,
One of you will betray me.
Matthew 26:21. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The disciples began looking at one another, each face searching for an answer. Judas asked, Rabbi, is it I? Matthew 26:25. Jesus answered him,
You have said it.
Matthew 26:25. Still, the room did not fully understand what was happening. Jesus dipped the bread and gave it to Judas. A final act of closeness passed into the hands of the betrayer.
What you are going to do quickly.
John 13:27. Judas took the bread and left. John says it simply, but the words carry the whole weight of the night. And it was night. John 13:30. Inside, the meal continued with the disciples who remained. Back in the room, Jesus took bread and gave it new meaning.
This is my body, which is given for you.
Luke 22:19. Then he took the cup and spoke of a covenant in his blood.
This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you.
Luke 22:20. The disciples heard the words, but they could not yet carry their meaning. Then Peter spoke with the confidence that had always made him sound unshakable.
Lord, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death.
Luke 22:33. Peter meant it when he said it. But Jesus already saw the courtyard, the fire, and the fear waiting for him. He answered,
The rooster will not crow this day, until you deny 3 times that you know me.
Luke 22:34. Peter heard the warning, but he could not imagine himself inside it. Still, Jesus did not send him away. He let Peter remain close, even knowing how close the denial was. The men whose feet had just been washed would soon discover themselves. Jesus led the disciples from the room and into Jerusalem's darkened streets. They crossed the Kidron Valley and climbed toward the Mount of Olives. There was a garden there, a place Jesus had gone many times before. Its name was Gethsemane, the place of the oil press. Jesus left most of the disciples near the entrance of the garden. Then he took Peter, James, and John deeper into the trees. He said,
My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death.
Matthew 26:38. Then he asked them to stay there and keep watch with him. Jesus walked a little farther, alone beneath the trees. The distance between him and the disciples was not great, but no one could follow him into what waited. He fell on his face and prayed to the Father.
O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me.
Matthew 26:39. The trial, the scourging, the mockery, the nails, and the cross were already before him. Priests, soldiers, an angry crowd, and the hill outside the city all stood on the path ahead. And still, after asking if another way was possible, he surrendered.
Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will.
Matthew 26:39. When Jesus returned to the disciples, he found them sleeping. Their eyes were closed while the sorrow of Jesus filled the garden. He said,
Could you not watch with me 1 hour?
Matthew 26:40. After 3 years of walking with him, they could not stay awake through the hour he asked of them.
Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation.
Matthew 26:41. Then he gave them words that would soon follow Peter into the courtyard. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Peter's spirit was willing, but the night would soon test more than intention. Jesus went away and prayed again while the disciples struggled against sleep. Grief made their eyes heavy, and the garden grew quiet around them. Again, Jesus returned and found them unable to watch. A third time, he went away and prayed the same prayer. Luke says his agony became so intense that his sweat fell like drops of blood. While Jesus prayed, the disciples slept beneath the trees. When he returned again, the time for watching had passed. He said,
Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.
Matthew 26:46. The silence broke under the sound of footsteps moving toward the garden. Torches appeared between the trees, their flames shaking against the dark. Judas walked at the front, leading soldiers to a place he knew well. He came close enough for Jesus to feel his breath. Then Judas said,
Greetings, Rabbi.
Matthew 26:49. A gesture of love became the signal for arrest. Jesus answered him with a word that still feels impossible.
Friend, why have you come?
Matthew 26:50. Even in that moment, Jesus addressed Judas without hatred. Then the men stepped forward and seized Jesus. Peter saw hands laid on the teacher he loved and reached for a sword. He struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Jesus stopped him and said,
Put your sword back in its place.
Matthew 26:52. Then Jesus touched the wounded man and healed the servant. Even in the moment of arrest, mercy was still moving through his hands. Jesus looked at the crowd and exposed the shame of their coming.
Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs?
Matthew 26:55. Then the moment arrived that the disciples had not believed would come. Jesus was seized and the garden filled with soldiers. The men whose feet had just been washed turned and ran into the night. Peter ran too, but some part of him could not leave completely. He followed Jesus from a distance that felt safer to him, near enough to see what happened, but far enough to avoid being identified. That distance would lead him to a fire. The soldiers led Jesus from the garden toward the house of the high priest. Peter followed behind them, far enough to avoid notice, but close enough to see where they were taking him. By the time he reached the courtyard, the trial had already begun inside. Jesus was beyond the doorway, surrounded by priests, guards, and witnesses trying to build a case against him. Peter stayed outside and sat near the fire with the servants and officers. The flames lit his face for a moment, then hid it again in shadow. Only hours earlier, he had said he was ready to follow Jesus to prison and death. Now he sat among the guards, hoping no one would recognize him. From inside the house, voices rose and fell through the night. Questions were being asked, accusations were being shaped. Then a servant girl looked at Peter carefully in the firelight. She said,
"You also were with Jesus of Galilee."
Matthew 26:69. Peter answered quickly,
I do not know what you are saying.
Matthew 26:70. No one seized him after the first denial. The trial continued inside. The fire kept burning, and Peter remained where he was. A little later, he moved toward the gateway, away from the center of the courtyard. Another servant girl saw him there and spoke to the people nearby.
"This fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth."
Matthew 26:71. This time, Peter answered with an oath.
I do not know the man.
Matthew 26:72. The words were colder than the first denial. Jesus was no longer Lord in that sentence, not teacher, not the one who had called him from the water. He was only the man. Time passed, and the night pressed on. The people near the fire began listening more closely to Peter's voice. His accent gave him away. They said,
"Surely you also are one of them, for your accent betrays you."
Matthew 26:73.
I do not know the man.
Matthew 26:74. The words had barely left his mouth when the rooster crowed. In that moment, everything Jesus had said came back to him. Before the rooster crowed, Peter would deny him 3 times. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. Luke 22:61. There was no need for another accusation. The warning, the supper, and Peter's own promise collapsed into one moment. Peter left the courtyard and went out into the night, weeping bitterly. Somewhere in the same city, Judas was also carrying the weight of what he had done. Judas had walked with Jesus for 3 years and still chose silver. Peter had been warned, loved, yet still denied him by the fire. But what happened next would separate their stories forever. The difference between Judas and Peter was not that only one of them failed. The difference was where their regret would take them. By morning, Jesus had been bound and taken from the high priest to Pilate. The priests had made their decision, and they wanted Rome to finish what they had begun. But somewhere in Jerusalem, Judas saw what his choice had become. The silver had not forced Jesus to defend himself. It had not brought the kingdom Judas may have imagined. Matthew says Judas was filled with remorse when he saw that Jesus had been condemned. So he went back to the chief priests and elders with the 30 pieces of silver. The same hands that had accepted payment now tried to give the payment back. He said,
I have sinned by betraying innocent blood.
Matthew 27:4. For one terrible moment, Judas told the truth. Jesus was innocent, the money was blood money, and the betrayal was sin. But the men who had paid him had no interest in his confession. They answered,
What is that to us? You see to it.
Matthew 27:4. They had used him, and now they left him alone with what he had done. Judas threw the silver into the temple and walked away. The price of betrayal had become too heavy to hold. But returning the money could not undo the kiss in the garden. After that, Judas went out and hanged himself. The story does not soften the ending. It leaves us with a man who saw his sin clearly, but could not see a way back. He had heard Jesus speak of mercy. He had heard Jesus call him friend in the garden. Still, when guilt crushed him, Judas did not return to the one he had betrayed. In another part of the city, Peter was also carrying the weight of failure. The rooster had crowed, Jesus had looked at him, and Peter had gone out weeping. He could not return to the courtyard and gather the words back into his mouth. But Peter was still alive inside his grief. Both men had walked with Jesus. Both men had heard his words. Judas carried his guilt toward despair. Peter carried his shame into tears and survived the night with it. Their regret did not lead them to the same ending. The priests picked up the coins Judas had thrown down. They used the silver to buy a potter's field, a place connected with death and burial. The price of betrayal became land for strangers with nowhere else to rest. Meanwhile, Jesus was moving closer to the cross. The disciples were scattered, hidden behind fear and stunned by what the night had done. The men who had argued about greatness were now afraid to be seen. Peter had no answer for his own failure. Judas had no hope strong enough to survive his remorse. The others had no courage left to gather around the one they loved. And Jesus, the only one without guilt, was carrying the weight of all of them. This is where the question becomes painful. Is there still a way back after you have failed the one who loved you? The answer would not come from their strength or their ability to repair what they broke. It would come from the one they had failed. Before mercy could restore Peter, the cross would have to receive Jesus. Before the fire on the beach, there would be nails in his hands. Before the question, "Do you love me?" there would be death outside Jerusalem. The story had reached its darkest hour, and for everyone who loved Jesus, it looked like there would be no morning. For 3 days, the disciples remained behind fear and locked doors. Jesus had died in public, and their failure had not died with him. Peter still carried the courtyard inside him. The others still carried the memory of running when the soldiers came. Judas was gone, and the 12 were no longer 12. Everything Jesus had warned them about had happened exactly as he said. They had failed him after being told they would fail. Somewhere in Jerusalem, priests believed the problem had been solved. Roman soldiers guarded the tomb, sealing the body of the man they had crucified. Behind closed doors, the disciples waited, afraid of what might happen next. Peter was among them, but he was not the same man who entered Jerusalem. The old confidence had burned away beside the courtyard fire. All he had was the memory of Jesus looking at him after the third denial. Then, before sunrise on the third day, women went to the tomb. They carried spices, expecting to finish the work death had interrupted. They were walking toward a sealed grave and a body they loved. But when they reached the place, the stone had been rolled away. The tomb was open, and the body of Jesus was not there. An angel said,
He is not here, for he is risen, as he said.
Matthew 28:6. The women ran back with fear, joy, confusion, and breathless hope. When the disciples heard them, the report sounded impossible. Grief had made resurrection feel less believable than death. Still, Peter got up and ran to the tomb. John ran with him, and the 2 men raced through the waking city. When he reached the tomb, he saw the linen cloths lying there. The body was gone. But Peter still did not understand everything. Then Jesus began appearing to his followers. Later, Jesus came into the locked room where the disciples were hiding. He stood among the very people who had abandoned him. The first word he spoke was not accusation.
Peace be with you.
John 20:19. He showed them his hands and his side. The wounds were still there. The disciples rejoiced when they saw him, but Peter still needed something more. Jesus had given peace to the room, but Peter's denial had happened by a fire. So the story moves back to water. Peter and several disciples returned to the Sea of Galilee. They went out in a boat and worked through the night. The nets came back empty. At dawn, a figure stood on the shore and called to them. He told them to cast the net on the other side. They obeyed, and the net filled with more fish than they could pull in. John recognized the miracle first and said,
It is the Lord.
John 21:7. Peter did not wait for the boat to reach the shore. He threw himself into the water and swam toward Jesus. The man who had followed at a distance now rushed through the waves to reach him. When they came to land, they found a charcoal fire already burning. Peter's denial had happened beside a fire in the courtyard. Now Jesus had prepared another fire on the shore. Fish and bread waited there. Jesus fed them. After they had eaten, Jesus turned to Peter. He asked,
Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?
John 21:15.
Yes, Lord.
Peter answered,
You know that I love you.
John 21:15. Jesus said,
Feed my lambs.
John 21:15. A second time, Jesus asked him if he loved him. Peter answered again, and Jesus gave him another charge. Then came the third question. Jesus asked,
Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?
John 21:17. This time, Peter was hurt. 3 denials had come from Peter's mouth beside one fire. 3 questions now came from Jesus beside another. Peter said,
Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you.
John 21:17. There was no boasting left in that answer. Peter placed his love before the one who already knew everything. After the third answer, Jesus said,
Feed my sheep.
John 21:17. The man who denied knowing Jesus was now commanded to care for his people. The disciple who failed by a fire was restored by a fire. The one who once asked about 70 times 7 now stood inside its meaning. Peter had wanted to know where forgiveness could stop. Now mercy had found him after his own repeated failure. From that morning forward, Peter would never preach as a man who had never fallen. He would preach as a man who had been brought back. His story did not end with bitter tears in the dark. It continued because mercy came looking for him at sunrise. So the story leaves us with 2 men standing in the shadow of the same Jesus. Judas and Peter both failed him in the final hours before the cross. Their sins were not identical, and their hearts were not the same. But both men discovered the terrible weight of betraying love. One man tried to return the price of his betrayal. The other had nothing to return except a broken heart. This story cannot be reduced to Peter being good and Judas being evil. Judas had walked with Jesus, heard mercy, received friendship, and still chose betrayal. Peter had loved Jesus, promised loyalty, received warning, and still chose self-protection. Both men were exposed by the same night. The difference was not that one failed while the other remained faithful. The difference was where each man carried the failure afterward. Judas carried his guilt back to the men who had paid him. They had no mercy to offer because they had never loved him. Peter carried his shame into tears, silence, and the memory of Jesus' look. He had no way to defend himself and no way to undo the words. But he remained alive long enough for mercy to find him again. 3 times, Peter had said he did not know Jesus. 3 times, Jesus gave him space to say he loved him. That is what 70 times 7 looks like when it becomes flesh. The nails, the blood, the mockery, and the darkness show the cost of evil. But the empty tomb tells us mercy is stronger than the grave. Some people spend years trapped beside their own courtyard fire. Others carry silver in different forms. A choice they made, a person they wounded, a truth they sold for comfort, approval, safety, or control. Is there still a way back? Peter's story answers with mercy. Judas's story warns us not to let guilt become our final voice. You may not be able to undo what happened, but mercy does not begin with your ability to repair the past. It begins with the one you failed still calling you forward. So if your failure has made you wonder whether there is still a way back, Peter's tears and Jesus' mercy give the answer. The way back is through returning to the one who already knew and still loved. Because the same Jesus who taught 70 times 7 did not only command mercy, he became mercy for the ones who had no answer left. And that is why your story does not have to end where you failed. The question is still being asked. Do you love me? If the answer is yes, then there is still a way forward.